I think, soft skills in anything, whether it's in your career or in the way you're managing your relationships, I think soft skills are important. And in particular, very important in the context of leadership. We have, essential skills, things like being able to communicate effectively, being able to be resilient in the face of pressure, being able to influence people around us in a positive way so that they get on board together in their projects. And I think it's really important out of all of the soft skills, probably resilience and adaptability are the two key ones. And I think if I share a quick story just to share this, I think it's the ability to be able to jump back quickly to anything that may be happening, particularly if it's unexpected. What we know is that there's a number of things that can go on in work situations or in the workplace, and we don't always, despite planning, despite being proactive and prepared, we don't always anticipate that everything that we put our hands to is going to turn out exactly the way that we want it. And so what I've seen to be one of the most important soft skills of leadership is the ability to be adaptable, especially when things don't turn out in relation to expectation. And we saw this with a leader who had a very, very big project. There was probably 18 months of project planning that went into this. And they felt like they had everything under control. They had the team they needed, the resources they needed, and briefs from the clients, a lot of proactive project management. And then at the last minute, one of the key stakeholders actually had a change in their staffing. And so a lot of the things that they'd planned weren't necessarily working for the people that they were now going to be dealing with. And now, under a huge amount of pressure, this person could have potentially called off the whole project. They may have, potentially crumbled under that pressure and said, well, look at all of this work that's now gone to waste. It's almost like we have to start again. But what they actually did was they quickly took a brief to understand what was the motivation for the key changes, and then through that process of analysis actually looked for adaptation. Now, I think that everybody has the capability to do this. What's really important is the speed to being able to do that. I think a lot of people waste time in complaining about what went wrong or why it went wrong, or trying to look for justifications, or sometimes looking to blame whose fault it might be. But the ability of this particular leader to be able to switch into problem solving mode and to understand that, yes, criteria had shifted, but here's what we need to do now, rather than wasting the time to actually go through and try and assess why it was that all of these things were taking place. Skills are just such an important thing, and often can be overlooked in today's climate with the advancement of technology. I think it's really hard to pick just five, but if we talk about essential skills like communication and the ability to communicate your message effectively, to have an understanding of the different elements of emotional intelligence, to be influential. How do we share our message with people and get people bought in and motivated to get on board in a project? And of course, two of the really important ones that follow on from those things is resilience and adaptability. And so I think if we had to zero in, the resilience and adaptability are super important, but it's actually about the speed to impact more than anything else. I'll take an example. We were working with a leader who had a major project. This project had been pre-planned and milestoned and worked out over a period of nearly 18 months. And they had everything organized. They were proactive. They knew what their plan was going to be and how they were going to create success. And then probably around about 15 days before they hit go and to go live on this project, there was a major provider in the project that actually had a complete transformation in their team, and they changed over all of their staff. Now, I think for most people, the response to this would be potentially one of anger, frustration. Look at all this work that we've done. Look at how we have to almost start again. And this particular leader not only was resilient, and when I say resilient, I mean that they were able to look at the situation, and rather than spending time blaming, making excuses, trying to look for someone at fault, what they did was get clarity around, what was the motivation for the change? How did they need to redeploy? And how quickly could they do that, preserving the information and the things that they'd already put in place? And so when we talk about a leader who demonstrates great skills, particularly in the areas of soft skills, I think it's really got a lot to do with the speed to impact, because so many people can waste so much time getting below the line and potentially, creating some challenges with their relationships with people, instead of looking at how they can adapt quickly and efficiently for the resources that they have. And so really it's about that speed of impact and that adaptability, or the flexibility of response to those outcomes. Brad, I think as part of the conversations about soft skills, we we have a lot of people that know that they're important, but they don't necessarily know what it means to build some of these skills in a real world scenario. And so when people are already busy leading, what's some of your advice around how people can actually build out some of these skills?
Yeah, very good. And again, it's one of those things, you might think you're really good at the soft skills, but what are they in comparison to what's your measurement of that? And I think one of the ways of looking at that is going through the process of actively listening, and listening with intention, not listening to respond, or listening for how you contribute. Being interested rather than interesting are some fundamentals there if we were to chunk right up and go big picture. But I really think that the most important thing to do to sharpen their skills is really understanding the concept of the process we talk about when it comes down to cause and effect. All right. When you're at the effect of someone or something, you're getting reasons why you can't do it. When you're a cause, you're getting results. And when you take this on yourself and you're self-reflecting on this to bring into your self-awareness, the communication you're having, how are you turning up? Are you looking at every conversation to learn something about this person, learn about what's going on, asking really good quality, deep questions to be able to get into that there to find out what's going on, and having and flipping that intention from communicating for the sake of articulating a task, communicating for the sake of getting feedback on a work-related scenario, as to really thinking about what is the message I'm getting across here. Am I communicating with this person in getting a result in the evidence of them taking on board what I'm saying? And as a result of that, you start thinking about how you're saying things. And one of my favorite saying is that say it the way you want it. And a lot of the times people will talk and not actually be saying the actual outcome that they want. So these are some fundamentals of understanding how to communicate. And again, the great thing about this is, to your point, there's very fast feedback on that. So you're getting feedback in that moment on asking those questions, getting deeper into that process, improving your active listening with intention. And then obviously the other thing that a lot of leaders have a hard time asking for and taking on board is creating a framework for being able to ask for feedback. And sometimes the feedback is not necessarily about criticism. It can be feedback on how you can improve the communication. Then it might be feedback in what that person got out of the conversation. So it might be, so from that last conversation, from our last one-on-one, whatever it is, what feedback have you got as far as how we can improve our communication? What feedback have you got as far as how I'm communicating to get the message across? Is there any ambiguity, or are we clear on what that is? I think that makes a big difference moving forward if you're going into every conversation with that intention and finding out what the person's really thinking about and going through to improve your emotional intelligence and also your communication, and being able to build on that. So, Chandel, tell me, how can leaders improve their emotional intelligence, especially in a stressful situation when you're really going to get tested by it?
Isn't that when it actually counts? I mean, everybody can respond perfectly into perfect circumstances. I think it's a really good question, Brad. And I think this is where we actually see the crossover between professional development and personal development. A lot of the time when we do professional development programs, people say, oh, well, why are we talking about my personal life? And the reality is that the leader we show up as is really, the sum total of who we are as an individual and what resources we bring forward. And so the workplace is a great place to bring out stressful situations, and people will revert back to their last developed area when they're under pressure. So my advice in this area is really to be mindful of your ability to be in charge of how to minimize that, for sure. So that's the first 15%, if you like. So how do we plan for the most minimal amount of challenges or obstacles coming to the forefront? That's part of being organized, a lot to do with your time. But more importantly, how are you at managing your state? So I often will talk to people about how they manage their state and what tools they have in their tool belt to be able to manage their reactions or their lack of reactions to something. So, practical things like taking a pause before responding. There's many leaders that, are under time pressures. So they go to respond before they've given themselves a beat to actually think about what they would like to say. Practicing a process of having a bit of empathy. You might be really cross with something that one of your team members has brought to you, being able to try on the hat for a moment and kind of look at the situation as if you were them. How would you be responding to that situation, which allows you to kind of create some of that empathy, and also kind of calibrating. And I know that that's a bit of a jargon word that we use in neurolinguistic programming. When we calibrate, we're kind of getting a sense of how things are landing with the people in front of us. So being aware of looking at someone's body language while you're sharing information with them, you'll be able to see if something is escalating for someone. A person who doesn't pick up on these cues might continue with their point and end up with a very stressful situation on their hand with someone reacting. In terms of managing your own situation and your own state, a couple of things that I think are really important is just making sure that you've got that ability to be prepared. Preparation wins the race every day. And in the absence of being able to prepare, my top tip is really being able to take a beat and being able to say, I haven't got all of the information on that, and I'm very, very, I'm very keen to get you that response. Could you leave that with me and I'll come back to you by X date and time? So just making an agreement and being willing to be able to take a second to gather your thoughts. Remember that preparation is key.
For sure. A couple of ideas come to mind. And one of them was working with a leader who had a particular team member who was really taking the advantage of being past probationary period of time and taking a lot of sick leave. Now, the team were under a lot of pressure. Their headcount was low as it was, which meant that one team member down really put a lot of pressure on the rest of the team, including the leader of that business. And he found himself constantly working in there covering this person's sort of role as opposed to being able to work on the business and the team generally. And he ended up having a couple of team members that were sort of tag team, and typically they'd be sick on the Monday and they'd have a doctor's certificate that they had. So there was nothing he could do about it. And he was incredibly frustrated to the point where he would have a level of anxiety in the Monday morning waiting for the text message to come through, knowing the day he had ahead of him was just going to be running. So he was automatically in a high state of anxiety, high state of stress before he even got to the office, let alone dealing with the day. And of course, to sit down when that person does come down and to have that conversation, to be able to articulate the effect that person had constantly taking sick days and not turning up. And when they did turn up, they weren't really playing 100%. They were kind of barely there when they did turn up. The effect for him to be able to articulate the damage that this person was doing to their career, and also the effect on the rest of the team stress and how that meant how they turned up, was very difficult. He was very emotive in going through that process. Now, we got to work with him for a while for this because it kept on happening for quite a period of time. And it wasn't until we actually got through the process sort of going on and him to step back and going, okay, how are you going to have this conversation, taking in consideration, clearly the person's got stuff going on, but the need for them to turn up and have some ownership on what they're going through. As a result of that, he was able to sort of step out of the emotion, and he was able to look at it from more of a selling the concept of what's important to them to turn up and how to do that to help him be able to have that difficult conversation. I think, and it made a big difference. I've also seen it take place where I've got business owners who are under the pump in their business and they get caught up in doing tasks and things that they probably shouldn't be doing. They get caught up there doing there because they've got all this other pressure on their shoulders of all the things that are happening that need for them to be done. And then they get caught into these things that they shouldn't be doing as a business owner, but they kind of feel they need to. So they can't sort of disconnect from that. So they're bringing all the emotional stress of being a business owner into the conversation, and people that they're having a conversation with don't understand what's going off in the background there. So being able to break that barrier and not getting emotive and going through that makes a big difference. The other thing I've seen take place is in the context of sales, where a salesperson has almost been offended by the client's objection. And got quite irate or cranky with the client because of their objection that they've given them in that scenario. And again, that shows that they're not balancing the emotion. And I think if you see great debate, and there are versions of this in some versions of this in the political sort of frame, where you get people who are really, really good at having a really heated discussion without getting emotional. I think that's the difference, because we know that when we get emotional, our IQ drops, we become less resourceful. So the real advantage is to be able to make sure that you're clear on how you can be sure that you're coming into that with the right intention and doing what you can. So it's going to allow you to have really good quality, difficult conversations without actually having a negative effect on your emotional well-being as well as the clients as well.
It's an interesting conversation around soft skills versus hard skills. So I think this is something that we focus on a lot in the leadership programs. Brad, what do you think in terms of leaders measuring the impact of soft skills? And we often get a lot of questions about that, in a way that actually makes sense for their business. What thoughts do you have around that?
Yeah, it's a good one. And again, what is the measurement? You generally want to measure all sorts of things if it's worth doing to find if you should be doing it or not. And I think it makes real sense is that there are some things you just really can't track in a database of soft skills. You just can't track those sort of things, right? So I think one of the great things I've seen take place where leaders have been able to bring this to their awareness and then do it, and then have actually sort of seen the impact on this in the business that's directly related into actual activity and meeting KPIs. And it's the intention of actually going around there and making the focus of the leader to catch people doing the right thing. So often we're catching people doing the wrong thing. That's where we're at. We're looking at what the bad behavior, and it's very easy to measure and catch the bad behavior. I heard one leader say, one team member, he must be the most unluckiest guy ever. I go, why is that? I always seem to catch, I'm the only one who ever seems to catch him on Facebook, on his social media at the workplace. He's the most unlucky guy. Every time I walk in, I'm the one that catches him on that, doing the negative thing. All right. So, and I think when you actually flip that to going, and again, it comes back down to the intention of the leader, right? What's your intention? Do you need to lift the team up? Are you going to look at what's not working or look at what is working and double down on that? And that's the difference. When you start catching what people are doing well and bring it to their awareness, it certainly changes the culture. It sparks up. And again, it can relate to KPIs. I'll give you one example. We were looking at a particular KPI within the business, and what was happening is they were having a situation where it was a logistics business, had a situation where drivers weren't turning up on time. And then one of their KPIs was the time of being picked up to drop off. And it was a pretty significant KPI that they had to hit, and they were miles away from hitting this KPI. And through our process of a hot seat, we go through and we ask some questions. And one of the things was, well, who's doing it well? And what have you done to catch the people who are doing it well? And it was really clear that they don't actually catch people doing it well. So the next week, they put in place where the supervisor was going to call the people that were doing it right and calling up the people that are doing really well who actually turn up on time. Now, funnily enough, these people talked. And as a result of that, their KPIs peaked much higher, didn't quite hit their actual KPI, but they had never received a 12 to 15% increase on that KPI in anything they'd done. But they were able to measure the fact they had one person calling up to say, good job, well done, thank you very much for being on time for this pickup or this drop off. This is the difference it makes. Okay. And as a result of that change. So I could give other examples of that, but I think it's really clear that you need to be able to go through the process of going, okay, how can I catch what people are doing well and improving that? Other thing you can do as a business leader and owner is in the morning, walking around and saying hello to people, catching their name, saying hello, and remembering the important things. Remember the trivial things that they might say. Again, very hard to measure this as far as KPIs, but you will find that the culture will shift and change. And that process of just being human, being interested in your team and saying hello and good morning can also improve your ability to be able to measure what's the mood of the team, who's doing well, who's not doing well, just through that process of getting to know people and team. I think it make a huge difference.
The one that comes to mind for me in terms of how these soft skills can be measured in hard results is really we had this leader that we were working with, very competent, business acumen was amazing, very, very, very intelligent human being, and very self-disciplined. So this person had been an athlete in a previous life, and as you know, in high performance sport there's a lot of discipline, and so they had adopted a mindset for themselves that, you know, no excuses, make it happen, and they were extremely disciplined in their nature with themselves. And the challenge was that didn't translate into the way that they actually worked with other people. Now, before you get ahead of yourself thinking that he allowed substandard behavior, I think it's really important to say that this person, in his nature and his approach, he was quite, for lack of a better term, vicious in his approach with his team. So because he had that hardcore, no excuses, make it happen kind of mentality, and he had accepted that for himself, and it had brought him a lot of success, he took that to the team and also didn't notice the impact that it would have sometimes when he would deliver those home truths. Now, what we did was we actually worked with this individual and taught them how to notice what the impact of the words and the approach in delivery of the information was actually landing with the people in front of him. In addition to that, he stopped making assumptions that everyone that he was dealing with was as capable of dealing with setbacks or, being in trouble or missing a KPI in the same way that he took to being motivated to correct it or motivated to fix it. And so what he started to do was to not compromise the messaging or the communication, because he's still very, very focused on making sure that people get great results. But he was able to look at the people in front of him and perhaps adapt the messaging in a way that that person had the capacity to be able to receive it. So being able to change his tone of voice, to perhaps change the time of the day, to offer a pre-frame so that people knew that a difficult conversation was about to happen so that they could be prepared and ask questions. And so what this did was it actually changed. So the measurable or the hard result was it actually changed the retention of staff over a period of 18 months. So they had basically 44% of their staff would leave within a 9-month period under this person's leadership for a period of time. And when we measured the 12 months and the 24 months after this huge change took place in their conduct, they actually retained 80% of the people that were working there over that period of time. So I think what we can see is that if we're not reflective and we don't look at ways that we can adapt, then people vote with their feet and they leave. And as we know, finding, attaining, and keeping staff in this climate is such a huge issue. So that's an idea that comes to mind right now. And obviously, I think probably it bears mentioning that this person's enjoyment in the leadership roles also increased dramatically. If people are always having to drive the hard bargain as a leader and to have the hard conversations, and there's no joy or payoff from it, then life becomes pretty hard for the leader as well. And so by adopting this approach, not only did they see a fantastic result in terms of their attrition and retention rates within the staffing numbers, but there was also much more enjoyment in turning up to work every day and doing the job that needed to be done. Which leads me to another point here. When we talk about leading with impact, I think often there are top leaders that seem to have some secrets in their back pocket as far as their communication is concerned. So, Brad, talk to me about what you think is the biggest mistake, or even just one of the big mistakes that a lot of leaders can make when they're communicating with their teams.
Yeah, I think what happens is that most leadership journeys, you go from doing to mastering the doing to then being stepped up into a manager or a leader, and therefore your skill set is in the doing. All right, and that's great that you understand the role. However, being able to step back from the doing and then leading the next people to do the doing and you overseeing that is sometimes very, very difficult. So one of the biggest problems I see is under pressure, under stress, the person goes back to doing. They go back into the managing there, either showing people what to do it, leading by example, by doing the role, and telling people what to do, when to do it, giving tasks, as opposed to slowing down to speed up, to be able to enable and train the people in what they're doing or give that feedback. An example would be working with a business and the person who's very, very capable in their role is now being promoted, and they know what needs to happen and what needs to happen by when, and they've got this habit of just firing off tasks to be done. And then wondering why there's this revolt, this is not being done, and there's all this angst and pressure around these tasks because they're basically managing people to do activities as opposed to leading them and having the conversation about what's important about this task. This is the reason I've asked you to do it in this time frame, and being able to make sure that people understand that. And then the next part of that is making sure that people have ownership on that task, so it's not relying on the manager wannabe leader to manage people in that scenario. We end up getting from that transactional to transformational leadership. So the one key thing that comes with that communication is under pressure, going back to giving people the answers, telling people what to do, and managing them and getting close to that micromanagement as opposed to stepping back and slowing down to speed up and making sure that we're leading people to the ownership and leading people to understand the task, the job, whatever it is. What's the definition of good? When does it need to be done by? And measuring that as opposed to the task not being done in the first place. And I find that if we don't have that ownership, if we haven't communicated that, then you will be stuck in that role of being a leader who is a manager telling people what to do, wondering why you're stuck doing the same thing over and over again and why people don't actually do what you ask.
And this is a big reason why a lot of people are having to work outside of the hours that they're paid for in order to get things done. Because if you spend all your time managing your people during the time and making sure that they're ticking the boxes on their tasks, then your job happens outside of those hours and probably on weekends and evenings.
I think it'd be fundamental to make it very clear, very, very simple. The simple thing to do every day that'll make a difference is setting a daily goal for yourself that's team related. So what are you going to do today that's going to improve the team conversation, for morale? Not a goal for yourself personally that is your own personal goal. You can certainly do that every day, but setting out the intention of what are you going to do today? How are you going to sort of achieve that outcome? And the other thing I would suggest you do, might take a little bit more than 2 minutes depending on the size of your team, is just that morning check-in, going around saying good morning, saying hello, and being able to be personal within the team to take a temperature check on how things are going in the team in that dynamic. And again, in the online world, this will be harder and harder when we've got remote workplace, but still you can sort of do a check-in. And this is why I think it's so important to have those stand-ups in the morning with a remote team, that everyone has a bit of a chance to share and be personally, have some kind of human interaction that's not necessarily 100% work related. What's a team building strategy that leaders often overlook but really works, Chantel?
I think everybody wants to have stronger teams. Everybody wants to think that they're a great leader, and often people will spend a lot of time focusing on strategy and how do they become more effective with which leadership strategy should be the best one. Are we using this method or are we using that method? And before you know it, you've got more acronyms than you know how to define. And so it's probably going to surprise you what I say here, Brad. I think that a highly underrated but also highly effective method of being a fantastic leader, one that leads the charge but also is revered and followed, not because people think that they have to, but because they actually want to, is actually really about being able to know the individual as opposed to know your reports. And so many of us will have direct reports, we have dotted lines, we have people that report indirectly to us, directly to us. And so often I see leaders making sure that they understand what is the role, neglecting to remember that there's a human sitting in that role, and that person has a whole life and things that are important to them, people and animals maybe that they care about, and stuff that they enjoy doing when they're not working. And so one of the most effective things that I've seen people do really well. And it seems to make the leader more inspirational, is to actually make it about the people in your team. And often when we're coaching our clients, we say it's not about you. It's actually about the people that are in front of you. And so knowing the person, simple things like, do you know where the people in your team grew up? Do you know if they have siblings? Do you know perhaps maybe how they decided to get into the career that they're in right now, or what the transition of their career pathway looked like? What do they enjoy doing when they're not working? Do they have any crafts or hobbies, or particular interesting things that they like to do? And so sometimes just the simple process of actually getting together and sharing and talking about some of these things can actually strengthen the bonds of a team, because we actually start to see the human beings. And for anybody who is very results driven, please understand that I'm not suggesting that results and KPIs and measurables are not important in that process. I think we still need to make sure that there are effective methods to hold people to account to their activities, to their outcomes, and the things that they're actually working on, because that's part of being employed and being in a business. The challenge, though, is that sometimes we spend so much time focusing on those measurables and those OKRs or their KPIs or their critical drivers or their task lists, that we sometimes neglect to remember that actually the task lists don't do the work. An individual who's a human that has a whole bunch of things that they value and that are important to them, those are the people that are actually doing the work. So the more that we can invest. And you mentioned it earlier, Brad, when you said, the simple process of walking around the office and saying hello to people that may not be in your direct team or in your department, getting to know the people that are part of that tribe that is the work that we do, or the workplace that we spend a lot of our time in, even in remote teams, having a little huddle with someone online and just having a chat. Those things can be the difference that make the difference, and it makes you memorable as an individual. And certainly it builds that emotional bank account of people actually wanting to give you some of the things that you need.